Thank you, Mary. I'm well aware that I'm standing between you and the break, and I'm also well aware that this room full of technical, incredibly capable people is being spoken to by a lawyer history major on a highly technical subject. So let me just make a few points, and we can all go get some coffee. The problem of electromagnetic pulse and the vulnerability of our infrastructure, particularly the electric grid, is what someone who used to work for me called a malevolent problem as distinct from a malignant problem. Malignant problem can be awful, as we all know. We've faced, some of us ourselves, some of us relatives and spouses, we've faced cancer, and it can be horrible. But there's nobody sitting there in that tiny part of your body calculating how they can cause pain for you. When you're dealing with a malevolent problem, there is. It is a planned, systematic, going for your jugular. And we have now to consider and discuss what our situation is and can be in dealing especially with North Korea. It's not the only problem. Something even worse may come before us if when Iran gets a nuclear weapon. I think that agreement on Iran's nuclear capabilities is an extremely poor one and will lead to their having a nuclear weapon before long. And Iran, unlike North Korea, has a theocratic justification for what they are doing. They are perfectly willing, many of them, to die in pursuit of what they regard as God's will. So that can introduce elements into a decision about war or peace that is not present in most of our history. So we have a malevolent problem on our hands. And it is a different kind of malevolent problem than we faced during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. There were not just one or two, there were more like 7 or 8 events during the Cold War in which a decision at the last minute, occasionally by a national leader, occasionally by someone as low level as, say, a commander of a single Russian submarine, essentially disobeyed orders and refused to launch a nuclear torpedo, for example, at American warships, and kept the world from easing into nuclear war. I don't know why that's the case. I can only reflect in a thanking mode on Bismarck's line that the Lord God has special providence for fools, drunkards, and the United States of America. But we escaped by the skin of our teeth half a dozen times anyway during the Cold War from confrontations that could have led into nuclear exchanges between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And finally, the Soviets were interested in maintaining their power, but they were not so interested as to be able to restructure their economy to produce anything particularly of any value. And back during the 70s and 80s, their system began to deteriorate more and more, and it finally collapsed. I had just taken over the conventional armed forces in Europe negotiations for the U.S. as the ambassador and the chief negotiator in Vienna. And I was sitting eating a cold dinner on my coffee table, looking at the news with one eye at my apartment in Vienna when I saw the Berlin Wall collapse. And I thought, that might have some effect on my negotiations. Let me tell you, I have, I have, my, I lived in Germany or Austria for about 3 years of my life, and my German was once passable. I've never told a German a joke the German thought was funny. I've never had a German tell me a joke I thought was funny. Russians are different. Russians have a sense of humor that's based on wryness and self criticism and so forth that is clever and funny and witty. And in those 3 or 4 years after the Berlin Wall went down, during which I was closing a huge treaty with the Russians, let me tell you, you've never seen such nice Russians. They wanted to do all sorts of things with the United States. Whatever we wanted to do was fine with them. It was sweethearts. It was great. So Russia is complex. Its history is summed up best, I think, by what Abraham Lincoln said about the old farmer who owned the farm next to his family's when he was growing up. He said the old boy used to say, "I don't need much land, just what adjoins mine." And that's kind of Russia. I mean, China we got some problems with. Other countries we've had problems with over the years. Germany certainly was worse than that in the 30s, 40s. But generally speaking, the Russians tend to, when they're feeling their oats, tend to want to take over places that are near them. But when they're not feeling their oats and when they've lost on a treaty, you can work with Russians. But Cold War was something that we handled right. We handled right by deterring the use of nuclear weapons and by undermining their economy by our own economic growth and dominance. And we especially undermined it by working together with people like Lech Walesa and Václav Havel in supporting the growth of a spirit of democracy and rule of law in Eastern Europe, which ended up being a major part of the takeover by moderates such as Kosygin and other Russian leaders that were easier to deal with than we had sometimes had in the past. That's not what we face in North Korea. Would that we did. I don't really feel like I need to be too nostalgic about Brezhnev, but compared to Kim Jong-un, we have a very fundamental difficulty. It's because when we discovered in 1962, along with the Russians at the same time in those last tests that led to Starfish Prime and the understanding of the basics of EMP by both the Americans and the Russians, when that came about in 62, Americans over the years put this issue of EMP into a highly classified territory, and they gave it to the military and strategic commands to sort out, and we took care of hardening our Omaha, essentially. But we did nothing to speak of, nothing effective anyway, with respect to our electric grid, our civilian grid. And would anyone care to guess how many military bases are on their own power source rather than the grid? No, you're too pessimistic. There's one. Yeah, in California, heat, hot water, steam process. We do not have the capability of managing this complex society with the electric grid down. It will not work. It won't come close to working. Puerto Rico, multiply Puerto Rico by a factor of 50, and you have the United States without electric power. You have no food, you have no water, you have no telecommunications, you have no bank records. It is reflected to some extent in William Fortune's novels that I imagine some people here have read, like The 1 Second After and so forth. But we cannot exist that way. We would before long see Chinese on our Pacific coast and Russians probably on our east coast. We would be in the worst shape the country has ever been in. And whether it's brought about by hacking, as in Ted Koppel's book, or whether it's brought about by an electromagnetic pulse from a low Earth orbit nuclear weapons detonation, we face absolute societal disaster, not inconvenience, not just Britain in the 1940s, a world of warm beer and cold showers. It's not just that bad. It's much worse. And we have to realize that we don't have a very good feeling for where Kim Jong-un is in decision making, how he makes decisions, what he's going to do. People are full, historically, of claims that Hitler would never attack Poland and the rest of the countries in Europe, and that he would never invade Russia. There are all sorts of these bold claims by wise senior citizen statesmen. Turned out to be deadly wrong. We didn't understand what was motivating Hitler. He's talked about the 1,000-year Reich and killing all the Jews. We thought, he can't do that. That's crazy. But being crazy is different if you're mad, as Hamlet said, north by northwest, and you're crazy in the cause of destroying another civilization. And it looks very much as if that's what Kim Jong-un wants to do to us. And just because North Korea is a small country and a poverty-stricken one, and one that has very few resources except for what it has been able to get from other countries, I think largely Russia and China, and put into its capability to launch a satellite with a nuclear weapon on it, because it has that capability, it is a danger to our survival. North Korea does not need range, and it does not need reentry. The public citizens and so-called experts who talk about all this all the time talk as if they could not do any damage to us that matters unless they have an ICBM with accuracy and thousands of mile range. Nonsense. All they have to do is launch into low Earth orbit a satellite. Launching a satellite is the easiest thing to do in space. It's what the Russians did first with Sputnik. It's what we did 3 months later with our first shot. Getting into space up there 100, 200, 300 miles and having a nuclear weapon in the satellite is no big deal. No technological trick. Nothing that requires massive investments of time and effort. It just takes North Korea taking one of its nuclear weapons and sticking it in a satellite and launching. Now, but couldn't we shoot it down? Lots of people say, well, yeah, I mean, we can look at satellites and tell what they're doing. Suppose they launch to the south. The Russians have taught them something called a fractional orbital bombardment system, in which they launch to the south, not the north. So all of our defenses and sensors are focused in the wrong place. We have not been defending ourselves with radars or anything else from the Brazilians and Argentinians. So if something is launched against us into an orbit from the south, in a south polar orbit, and comes up the other side of the Earth, and then detonates somewhere over the central United States, you've got your world of EMP fried electricity. Wouldn't we be able to tell what they were doing and shoot them down? I think it's very difficult to do that in the absence of having what many people in this room probably supported and worked on over the years, something like the right type of anti-ballistic missile system, particularly something like Brilliant Pebbles, that would be able to take something out in its boost phase. But once it's launched and is around the Earth and coming up on the other side at you, you don't have much you could do that I can see. Someone may be able to convince me otherwise. I'll close with this thought. It's not a pretty one, but it was originated by two remarkably able individuals, both of whom are friends of mine. 9 years ago, after Bill Perry was Secretary of Defense and before Ash Carter was Secretary of Defense, Perry and Carter together wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post that said, essentially, because of some decisions that have recently been made, North Korea is going to have a nuclear weapon very soon. We have to figure out how to deal with that. Now, this is not Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan. It's not even two neocons. It's Bill Perry and Ash Carter, two moderate, reasonable, highly able individuals. They said there's only one thing we can think of to do. Put a number of American submarines around the Korean Peninsula armed with cruise missiles. Conventional warhead, not nuclear. As soon as the North Koreans move anything out of storage or start to take it to a launch facility or start to take it to a test facility, immediately destroy it. Not make a statement at the UN. Destroy it. If we can't do that, if the North Koreans are planning on a southern polar launch into a satellite status, they've got nukes, they've got satellites, they've launched satellites to the south. If they get that into orbit, we are in very, very bad shape, to put it as gently as I possibly can. I wish there were another answer. I really, really, really wish there were another answer. I can't find another one. I hope someone here does. Thank you. I'm told I can answer some questions. Maybe I can, maybe I can't, but I'll take a stab at them. Yes, in the back. Eyes and ears where?
Pine Gap, Australia. We have a massive.
I think we.
Pine Gap.
I think we have. Yeah, we have some, but I don't think we have the kind of thing we were starting to build to deal with launches over the North Pole in the traditional places with the Soviets, thinking of the Soviets coming after us. Because what you really need is a extended defensive capability with infrared and with radars and with being able to detect things at different altitudes and so forth. And I think we could have that. We could do it, but I think the chances of even in today's fiscal situation for the Defense Department of getting money to build something as elaborate as what we've started to do facing north and build it facing south as well would be something that would be so costly that we wouldn't get very far. We have a hard time getting anywhere now to deal with this problem, because a lot of people would just not like to think about malevolent problems. They'll think about malignant ones, but they don't want to worry their heads about somebody going after them. And I'm afraid the financial situation would be such that it'd be almost impossible to get something like that funded.
Jim, can I help you a little bit?
Yeah, that'd be great, Hank.
There are a couple of things that we can do, and I hope are doing. First of all, you're right in terms of the historical development of our missile defense programs, and we didn't have the radar and other sensor systems to provide track information. If we had that information with sufficient accuracy, the ground-based interceptors in California at Vandenberg Air Force Base could in fact shoot down those satellites. But what's needed is the forward-based sensors and so on. If we had the right kind of radar, and I believe the TIPI-2 radar that goes with that is sufficient to provide that early track information to enable that possibility. Secondly, and maybe you could influence this as a former Undersecretary of the Navy and your other role there, we have now, I don't know how many Aegis BMD ships in the neighborhood of North Korea. We have 3 carrier task forces, not task forces, attack forces, or whatever they're called, each of which has 3 destroyers, cruiser, whatever combinations there, and the Japanese themselves have 4, I think, BMD Aegis ships. If the crews are prepared, have trained, and are authorized to do so, and by authorized I mean the captain on those ships, they can shoot down a launch out of North Korea in its ascent phase, not boost phase as you referred to, but as it's still going up just out of the Earth's atmosphere, if you will. And we've tested that capability. It is doable, technically. The question is whether or not they're prepared, authorized, and the authorization is the most important aspect of that, because you have literally seconds to minutes to act, and you can't consult with the president or even the commander of the 7th Fleet or whatever. Thirdly, if you did a little bit of training, aircraft owned, I'm not sure which of the aircraft is inherently capable, but by the Navy and by the Air Force to use AMRAAM, which is an air-to-air missile, those systems would have to go into harm's way to do it. But if the North Koreans follow the tradition they have before, we'll know when it is they're setting up to launch satellites south. And if we're prepared to do that, we could shoot down in launch phase. But other than that, we're many months away from building a boost phase capability.
Thank you. That's great points. One thing I'd add is most of the writings on this that I've been through anyway say that one thing that would be affected very immediately would be aircraft, and that aircraft in the air would largely be crashed as a result of the EMP, knocking out their electronics. I don't know whether that also applies to military capabilities, such as radars on ships and the rest. It depends on whether they got hardened when they were built and how diligent people were in thinking up how to deal with this malevolent problem from 1962. But unless those maybe Aegis destroyers and others were built with a substantial resilience to EMP, then we got that problem. Yes, sir.
Chuck Manta, a quick question. Aside from what our military and political leaders might do on the military side, what are the kinds of things that civilian infrastructure or technology people, people in local jurisdictions and companies, what are the kinds of things that we might be able to do to put ourselves in a much better position than we are now, given that we are so vulnerable?
Well, most of the discussion I've heard and seen suggests that what we are about is being able to either harden everything or rebuild everything so we don't lose any capability for electricity. We don't have to do the British thing of warm beer and cold showers. But if our standard is that degree of perfection, we're never going to get there. Or if we do get there, it'll be at such high cost and take us so long it won't do any good. We have to realize that 40%, say, of our electricity, if we can somehow hold on to it at the house, having 40% of the electricity that you need, it's not going to run an aluminum plant, but it's so much better than having none of the electricity that you need that a lot of our planning for, let's say, house by house solar, I had solar on my roof of my farm 8-9 years ago and charged my Chevy Volt from it and drove 25 miles a day on sunshine. It's not that impossible to do. And some of these technologies are getting better. So I think we ought to find some way to financially make it easier, and Chuck, you've been working on that, and understand how we can incentivize people to have a reserve electricity capability, which they will let them do the essentials and purify water and cook dinner and so forth, keep the refrigerator going, let them handle the basics even though they don't get everything. The perfection is our real enemy here in trying to make this operate in a simple, resilient fashion.
Ambassador Woolsey, if we take the approach of hardening our infrastructure to render the North Korean weapons ineffective in achieving their goal of collapsing our society, would that then lessen the probability that they might actually be used?
Would that lessen the chance that the weapons?
That the North Koreans would actually launch?
Yeah, I think if they felt, part of the problem here is that we've not done this during times before North Korea had a nuclear weapon, the way Perry and Carter suggested. So we're now trying to figure out how to do it under the threat of their already having the capability, which is really, really tough. But if you could have some kind of national program that gave people incentive to have 20, 30, 40% of their electricity in a resilient fashion, let's say solar panels on the roof, then I think that would probably help deter the North Koreans, because what they think now and have said is that they can utterly destroy us. And it's not an empty boast. I wish it were. I wish it were.
I've got a question. I come from a nuclear forces background, but at the end of the day, the only solution to North Korea, and later on maybe to Iran, is nuke them till they glow. It's a horrible thing, but do we have the guts, I guess you'd call it, to take out North Korea? Because all of the wonderful minds in this room have got good ideas to let them do what they're doing and survive it. And maybe the opposite is the reason.
Well, the problem is that the edge of North Korea is in the suburbs of Seoul, and Seoul is a huge city and occupies most of northern Iran, northern Korea, South Korea, and it is a real struggle to figure out, I think, how you would launch a conventional attack, let's say, to take out North Korean forces, and then the retaliation, not just from a few hundred missiles, but from a few thousand artillery pieces coming back at Seoul. We've also got, what, 40,000 or so Americans over there. So it's hard to analyze how you could do this other than by starting a conventional war that would be one of the bloodiest ever fought. Now we have a Secretary of Defense, Jim Mad Dog Mattis, who understands these issues better than most anybody. Maybe he's got a plan of how to do it. God bless him if he does. Yeah.
Jim, thank you very much for your presentation. You're the only national leader who tells it like it is. This will be something like has never happened before. It will be a whole new world, and it's mealy-mouthed and whitewashed, and most of the leaders really diminish the effects of it. Let me ask you a question. If North Korea really wanted to hurt us with essentially no fear of retaliation, why wouldn't they come at us from the ocean, from a tramp steamer that they would then sink, so there's essentially no fingerprints on it? And that, as you pointed out, that doesn't have to be any re-entry. In fact, if you re-enter, it's too darn low. You need to detonate above the atmosphere. And accuracy really doesn't matter. If you miss by 100 miles, it really doesn't matter.
Right.
Why wouldn't they come at us from the ocean, so there's essentially no... And I think we have essentially no protection against that. Is that not correct?
Well, I think that's right. A launch from, let's say, a Scud launch from a tramp steamer in New York Harbor does the job. I think probably we would assume, and assume correctly, that if something like that happened, it was North Korea, and would not take any of their denials and would not require high evidentiary standards or anything. But that's because the Iranians aren't yet in the game. But if you had both Iranians and North Koreans in the game of death to America, it could be an uncertain situation which one had done it, or had they done it together, because they do work together.
Jim, can I give you one more quibble?
Sure.
If they launch, Roscoe, from off our east coast, and if again the captain of a few of those cruisers and destroyers in Norfolk are awake and have been charged with protecting against that, we have the physical capability to shoot that down off the east coast. But we don't have it in the Gulf of Mexico. We have absolutely no defense if there's a tramp steamer or whatever else that somehow gets into the Gulf of Mexico. And a few years ago, there was a North Korean vessel that made its way through the Panama Canal and was picked up with 2 SA-2s, as I recall.
Yeah.
Didn't have nuclear weapons on them, but they were Soviet nuclear-capable missiles that could have executed this kind of a scenario. And they actually, maybe it was a trial run, you know, but whatever. That was a North Korean steamer, made its way through and was picked up. I don't remember whether it was precisely in the Gulf where would have been a best launch point, but it was certainly threatening it. So that's a very serious problem.
Yeah. Thanks, Hank.
And we have no defense, absolutely none today.
Great addition. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much.